Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Planning and Scheduling Professional PSP study course. Let's start our video today, which is a quick one. This is an overview of the project planning processes as stated in the PSP study guide. And as we mentioned before, project planning consists of two major sections or two major processes: planning and scheduling. Planning process and scheduling process. We are here in the planning section or in the planning process. We discussed and reviewed up to now planning development input and data. We have reviewed the three inputs here in this section: contract requirements, identification of stakeholders, and constructability methods. So the next right here is considerations and constraints, planning development constraints and considerations. In this video, we will have a general overview of section 1, 2, planning development constraints and considerations. Before we start, I would like to review this: planning inputs and data. Planning inputs and data represent the initial effort of identifying the requirements to understand and implement the planning phase in the initial planning effort. Planning inputs and data represent the essential requirements to start the planning effort. It is a first step in the project planning. Without planning inputs and data, there will be no way even to plan for the project. As we know already, planning inputs and data consist of contract requirements, identification of stakeholders, and constructability methods. So without this, without contract requirements, identification of stakeholders, and constructability methods, either you will not be able to plan for the project, or let's say at least you will fail to build a valid plan, or let's say a valid program for the project, because you should plan contract requirements themselves. You should plan for stakeholders and their needs in the project. You should use constructability methods as a base for the project plan. So just to close this point here, planning inputs and data are the first step in the project planning, and planning inputs and data represent the essential requirements to start the planning effort. Coming now to planning constraints and considerations. Constraints and considerations represent the second step of the planning process. The purpose here, we can say, is taking into account the impact of the planning inputs and data in addition to the other project circumstances. Project circumstances mean those factors affecting the project or affecting the project planning in specific. So again here, as we mentioned, constraints and considerations represent the second step of the planning process. And the purpose here is to take into account the impact of the planning input and data in addition to the other project circumstances. The planning considerations and constraints subchapter consists of identification of resources, value engineering, stakeholders considerations, and project variables. So in this section, generally, we take into account or consider the impact of all of these considerations and constraints. We take into account the impact of resources, value engineering, the impact of stakeholders, as well as the other project variables. In the next video, we will continue to discuss the identification of resources as a first step in planning considerations and constraints. Here we have again a quick review of the general sequence of the project planning process. The first step, as we mentioned in the previous videos, perhaps would be a need for a project. A need for the project, considering the project business case, leads to initiate a project. Then we go through the project ideas and concepts to get the project needs done. And as we mentioned, from this point, the effort of planning development start. We use planning inputs to identify all requirements in order to understand and implement the planning phase. And as we mentioned, planning inputs and data represent the essential requirements to start the planning effort. It is a first step in the project planning. In the second step, we make some adjustments by applying project constraints and considerations, resource considerations, value engineering, and stakeholders considerations as well. Then we use planning outputs for the next process, the scheduling development process. Planning outputs here will act like inputs to the schedule development process, and then we can create the project schedule, and the approved project schedule will be project baseline. Project baseline, which will be used for project control and reporting. At the end, we close the project, and these efforts will become lessons learned, and it will be saved in the organization database in order to be used for the new projects. All right, now let's go directly to today's discussion. In accordance with our topic today, considerations and constraints, and from your understanding, you may clarify in the comments box the resources impact on the project, how the resources can affect the project, or how the resources can affect the project planning. And as usual, you may answer the question in the comments box.